Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, and I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, if you had told me before this season that Sam Bradford was going to be responsible for the two best teams in football this year, I don't think I would have believed you, but at least according to DVOA, that seems to be the case. We'd already talked about the Eagles several times this season, and we're going to skip them today, but they're still number 2 in DVOA despite the loss last week. But the new number 1 team in DVOA is Bradford's current team, the Minnesota Vikings. And I think there's quite a bit to talk about on this front, Aaron, so let's just dive right into those topics. Starting with the Vikings, they're the number 1 team in DVOA, and I think we have talked about them previously, maybe in our preseason thoughts about them, and just a general buzz about them has been about their defense, which is number 3 in defensive DVOA. But they've been very balanced overall. They're number 11 on offense and number 6 on special teams as well. So, they've been a very balanced team so far this season. But if you look a little bit deeper into their splits, there's a little bit of a skew on offense where they're 7th in passing DVOA, but last in rushing. So, Aaron, there's kind of a lot of questions that I could ask you about this, but let's start with the sort of basic one of, is this something that the Vikings are going to need to be concerned about going forward, like this one-dimensional nature? Is it going to prevent them from beating the elite teams in the future?
It's hard to tell. I think that it's better to be balanced than to be one-sided like this, certainly. I would prefer to be a balanced team because I subscribe to the Bill Belichick way of thinking, which is take away what your opponent does best. So you better be good at everything so that when they take away what you do best, you're still pretty good at what you do second best.
Makes sense.
And I would think that teams facing the Vikings would start to play them like this, that they would start to play them, favoring the pass instead of the run. I think people have it in their head that it's a run-focused team because they're thinking Adrian Peterson, but certainly that hasn't been the case this year. There's a really good similar team looking at football history and Football Outsiders history that strikes me as really similar to this.
Which team is it?
And that is the 2003 Tennessee Titans.
Oh, is that Eddie George era?
That is the end of the Eddie George era. That is Eddie George is washed up era, is what that is.
Okay, so right. Everybody was still imagining them to be running.
Steve McNair won co-MVP.
Okay, yeah.
And they were 11th on defense in DVOA, but 3rd on offense. And the offense was split between number 1 passing and number 30 running.
Wow.
And they still went 12-4, but when it came time for the playoffs, they didn't make it all the way. They lost. But they lost in New England on the coldest night, I think the coldest home game New England has ever played. So it's hard to say, the problem was Eddie George. That being said, there was definitely a philosophical thing going on. It was a Jeff Fisher team, so you know what they did on offense. They just kept pushing Eddie George into the line for 2 yards of carry over and over again, and then were saved by Steve McNair being amazing on 3rd and long with the help of Derek Mason and Drew Bennett and whoever else was on that team at that time. I think Aaron Kinney maybe was the tight end. So that's the team that the Vikings have reminded me of, except that the Vikings defense is better. That defense was good, but they were still recovering from the salary cap purge after the Super Bowl in the 2000 team. And so that defense wasn't as good as this Vikings defense is.
So I'm not sure how much that one Titans team could tell us about this, but maybe you have other thoughts. Because it's been, I guess, one of your pillar ideas from Football Outsiders is that teams that build up leads tend to run the ball more in the second half because they're basically salting the game away, as opposed to, establishing the run in the beginning of things. So I was curious, the Vikings team has been up most of the season. Obviously, they're undefeated. Is the fact that that's been happening contributing to their lack of success rushing? I'm wondering whether defensive teams are like, hey, we're down. We know this team's going to run the ball to try to run the clock. Let's just jam the box and see what we can do to stop them.
Yeah, I don't think so. First of all, let me go back and point out there is one other team with a similar run-pass split. So these are the only 2 teams prior to this year that were bottom 5 in running and top 5 in passing since we went to 32 teams. The 03 Titans I mentioned. The other is the 2009 Chargers, who were first passing and 31st running. But that doesn't seem like a similar team to me because that team didn't have a good defense. But they did go 13-3, but they lost in the playoffs.
Right. Okay.
Just like those 3 Titans. As far as the Vikings offense, I mean, here's the thing. They're averaging 2.5 yards a carry in the first half of games and 2.4 yards a carry in the second half of games.
Pretty even.
So it's pretty even. I mean, we do put in DVOA, we put in adjustments for when you have the lead in the fourth quarter. We change the baseline based on how teams in the past have performed when they had the lead in the fourth quarter. And, of course, teams that have the lead in the fourth quarter don't gain as many yards per carry. They don't have as much success running because they're trying to kill clock. That being said, they usually run for more than 2.4 yards per carry for the entire second half of games. So, I do think that this is not because they're winning that they're so poor at running. They're just poor at running from the get-go, and it it was like this in the first game or two, and obviously it's even worse without Adrian Peterson.
How much has the schedule impacted this? So the 5 teams the Vikings have played so far are the Titans, who are 7th in total defensive DVOA, the Packers, who are 8th, the Panthers, who are 14th, the Giants, who are 16th, and the Texans, who are 13th, although they played them after they lost J.J. Watt. I don't know if you have any rushing or passing splits on those guys, but it seems like a fairly stout schedule in terms of defensive quality, but maybe not any of those teams being one of the elite defensive teams in the league.
Well, the Green Bay has this astonishing run-pass split on defense this year, where they are number 2 in run defense, and they're giving up something like 2 yards a carry.
Wow.
And they're 19th in pass defense on DVOA. So Baltimore has a slightly better run defense DVOA, and it's probably because of fumbles or something, because the Packers have just been really good.
Yeah.
And then Carolina also has been a much better run defense than pass defense. But on the flip, Houston has been a much better pass defense than run defense. So I think overall, it's hard to say that the schedule is the reason why their running game doesn't look good. I mean, obviously the opponent adjustments are not at full strength yet. And that Packers run defense has really been so good this year. I can definitely see where that's depressing numbers a little. But for the most part, this running game has just been terrible.
Yeah. So I don't know how much of that's related to their offensive line play or how much is related to their backs. As you mentioned, obviously not having Adrian Peterson, I'm sure, is hurting the team, even though he didn't perform super great in the first 2 games. But I was curious whether there might be a trade possibility for the Vikings. I mean, if they're looking like they're one of the elite teams, I would think that there maybe is a veteran running back. Matt Forte comes to mind on a team that may not be competitive this year that they could pick up. But, of course, trades never happen. Do you have any pipe dreams in this respect, or do you think anything might be realistic at all?
Well, I went and looked through the teams that are losing teams, and the only one that really did stand out to me as a team that has a losing, it's like a one-win team that has a veteran running back is the Jets with Forte. And they just signed him, so I don't know what the cap implications are there. Miami's got Arian Foster, but Foster's obviously battling injuries. And, if Minnesota wanted Arian Foster to be the backup, they could have grabbed him off the scrap heap at backup money,
Sure.
Cleveland's got young back. San Francisco has a young back. New Orleans isn't going to trade Ingram. Chris Ivory from Jacksonville, maybe, but no team is out of it in the AFC South, so no. Chicago is young backs. San Diego is young backs, so it really would just be Forte, and I guess Jonathan Stewart. I don't want to say mean things about Carolina.
We're coming back to that, and it's going to get worse.
A little bit, but
yeah.
I don't think that the problem is Jerick McKinnon and Matt Asiata, because 2 years ago, when Peterson was out for most of the year with the suspension for his legal problems, Minnesota was something like 2nd in run DVOA. Now, obviously, part of that was that without Peterson, teams were able to, they didn't stack the box against the run, and so there was more room for Asiata and McKinnon to run. But I would think that's happening now, and Asiata and McKinnon aren't getting the yards. The difference between 2 years ago and now is the offensive line. They lost a couple of starters last year, and then those guys didn't come back this year. We thought a big deal this year was going to be getting Phil Lodeholt back and getting John Sullivan back. And instead, Lodeholt retired, and they cut Sullivan. And then the guy who replaced Lodeholt, which was Andre Smith, is now injured. So they're not getting good offensive line play. They're 31st right now in adjusted line yards on offense. Now they're also 31st in open field yards and second level yards. It's not like the running is any better than the line is, but the line is not good. They've been surprisingly good in pass blocking. They're 5th in adjusted sack rate, which if you adjusted the sack rate further for having Matt Khalil on the line, that's actually 1st of all time.
Right.
So, I mean, the fact that Minnesota's line is not getting, that they're not giving sacks away is kind of remarkable, but again shows how amazingly pass-focused this offense is.
Okay, I have one more question about the Vikings, and it's not specifically related to their rushing attack. And I found this, frankly, really surprising. I don't know how I missed it, but the Vikings are the only undefeated team left in the NFL through 5 weeks. That seems really unusual to me. Is it unusual, Aaron?
I'm not sure how many teams we usually only have a couple of teams that are undefeated still at this point. Last year was the unusual year, right? Last year we had 6 teams, I think, that were 5-0. So that was the unusual year. Usually you get 2, maybe 3. So this is a little less than usual, but it's not that strange. What is strange, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago, is the sort of condensed quality of the league over the last couple of years. So if you look at the best DVOA in the league through week 5, Minnesota is the 3rd lowest team in 28 years.
Wow.
Only the 2010 Patriots and 2011 Bills were lower as the number 1 team through week 5. And if you look at Cleveland is the highest DVOA for a last place team in the last 28 years, except for the 2004 Miami Dolphins. So the whole league, like last year, the whole league is much more compressed than usual. And, the other thing that I've written about is that usually the strongest offense and strongest defense are stronger than, the strongest offense and worst offense are stronger than the strongest defense and worst defense. And this year, that's not generally the case, although after last week, we now have a case where the worst offense, which is Houston, is slightly stronger than the worst defense, which is Detroit. But on the other hand, the top defense, which is Seattle, is stronger than the top offense, which is Atlanta. So it's just kind of weird. Defenses are more extreme than usual over the last couple of years, while the league as a whole is more condensed. It's been kind of interesting.
It is interesting. And I love it when we give those sort of backhanded insults to Cleveland. Yes, you're the worst team in the league, but you're not historically terrible. So, we're moving in the right direction there.
No, we really are. Look, Cleveland this year, I realize we all wrote them off, and we had them projected as the worst team, and they're the worst team so far, and they're 0-5, and there's something like 50% to get the number 1 pick at this point, but
I like their offense.
There is talent on that team. There is stuff to build with on that team, and the fact that they are kind of the best last-place team ever, or second-best last-place team ever, is an indicator of how they're not a hopeless case.
I was actually kind of really looking forward to Josh Gordon coming back, and I know that isn't going to happen now, but if he and Terrell Pryor and the rookie Corey Coleman had all been together on that offense, that could have been terrifying for teams. But
especially if they had a real NFL quarterback, which they will next year when they draft Deshaun Watson or the kid from Miami or the Kaiser or whoever they end up drafting. And I will point people, by the way, to footballoutsiders.com, where today in Film Room, Kean Fahey breaks down our man Terrell Pryor and the technique that he has learned to become a number 1 receiver in such a short time, which is filled, by the way, speaking of the Minnesota Vikings, filled with backhanded insults of Cordarrelle Patterson.
Outstanding. Okay, well, everybody check that out. Meanwhile, we should go ahead and switch topics before we do a Vikings and Browns focused show entirely. So this next one, I'll build it up a little bit. The top 7 teams in DVOA are the Vikings, the Eagles, the Seahawks, the Steelers, the Falcons, the Packers, and the Broncos. And I would say that I would think most people think that those are 7 of the best 8 teams in the league. And the one team that's not in that group is the Patriots. And their total season DVOA probably doesn't reflect how good they are now that Brady is back with the team. Okay, So that behind us, the number 8 team in DVOA, I bet would come as a surprise to most people listening to this because it's the Buffalo Bills. And I think many of us wrote off the Bills after their opening start of 0-2. They fired their offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, at the time. And really at the time, their defense wasn't doing very well either. But since then, they've rattled off 3 wins. They beat the Cardinals. That was an impressive victory, but we'll talk about that more in a second. They shut out the Patriots, although the Patriots didn't have either of their first 2 quarterbacks. And then they beat the Rams, who actually are pretty good in DVOA as well. So I'll start by asking you, Aaron, are these good wins by DVOA? Are they more schedule-aided or, circumstance-aided with the Brady injury, et cetera? What are your thoughts on the Bills after the last 3 games?
Well, I will say the Rams are not a strong team in DVOA. They're 25th despite being 3-2.
Okay, my mistake there.
Their offense is so terrible. I do have to hand it to them. I was one of the people who thought they were. I left them for dead after they fired Roman because it made no sense to me because Roman did so well with that offense last year. And it certainly looked like Buffalo had turned into a circus between injuries and Marcel Darius, and then the statement that Marcel Darius put out, and Rex Ryan's "we're the kings of the offseason" nonsense, and I was wrong. He got that team together, and I think that I have read a lot of people saying, "See, it turned out that firing Greg Roman was the right thing to do," and I think that's nonsense. I think the idea that the improvement of that offense since the firing of Greg Roman that makes the first 2 games of this season more important than all 16 games of last season is silly.
Right.
But that, LaShawn McCoy is a good back. Tyrod Taylor is an underrated quarterback. So that, they've got some talent. So that, and they're playing better. And I've got to hand it to Rex Ryan that he's got his guys playing. It is so hard to tell what is going on with Buffalo, man, because last year was the weirdest year. I mean, for a Rex Ryan team to suddenly be terrible on defense and great on offense was weird. There's no question that the Patriots win was schedule-aided because there was no Brady and the third-string quarterback with a broken thumb. But at the same time, the first 2 Bills losses were very overrated by people. They only lost by 6 points. I think both were by 6 points. And they played particularly well against the Jets. I never understood why people were talking about that game afterwards as if the Bills were horrible in it because they lost by 6 points. The DVOA was almost average. I didn't watch the game because I took that Thursday night off to go see Okkervil River. And when I read about it afterwards, I was like, this doesn't bear any relation to the game I'm looking at in the box score. And the Bills have played a lot more since week 2 like the team I saw in the box score than like the team I read about on Twitter that night.
Maybe the reaction people had there was related just to the number of points that they were giving up. And so I have sort of a follow-up question about what exactly is the state of their defense. You mentioned Marcel Darius' injury. He hasn't played yet this season, and it looks like he suffered a setback and could be out again this week. Shaq Lawson, I think, is on the PUP list, so he'll be eligible to return in a couple of weeks if he's ready to. But, this was a defense that had a lot of talent but seemed very hurt entering the season, and that could be, presumably a big problem for them. But they've gotten some surprising success from a couple of guys that I guess that you wouldn't have necessarily expected. The number one being linebacker Lorenzo Alexander, who I had never heard of. He's leading the league with 7 sacks. He's got half a sack more than Von Miller. And he's 33 years old. He's an undrafted free agent. He's basically been a special teams player in his career, but he's currently leading the league in sacks. Also, Jerry Hughes, he is, I think, top 3 in total pressures behind Olivier Vernon and Jabal Sheard. So they're still generating a good amount of pressure even without some of their key players on defense. So they're I think they're 11th in DVOA overall in defense, but this is a team that could become a really good defense if they get those other guys back, right?
Right. I mean, they were a really good defense for a couple of years before last year, and Ryan historically has, run good defenses, except last year. But last year is what makes it hard to tell. The other guy, by the Lorenzo Alexander thing is crazy.
That's crazy.
Right? That guy is been a special teams, he's a good special teams player, but that's all he's been. 7 sacks, I don't know where that's coming from. And then the other guy you didn't mention who's really breaking out this year is Zach Brown. He's the linebacker.
Interior linebacker, right?
Used to be from Tennessee. Well, Interior, exterior depends on whether you think Buffalo is a 3-4 or 4-3. And it's kind of hard.
It's confusing.
But they are, right? Like, the Jets and Bills both have a thing where it's like they claim to be one kind of defense, but they're often playing the other kind of defense. So I don't really know. Is Zach Brown an outside linebacker in a 4-3, or is he an inside linebacker in a 3-4? Either way, he's the player who essentially replaces Reggie Ragland, who was the second-round pick.
Another guy that's, I think, out
who's
for
out
the year.
The whole
right,
year,
yeah.
right? Where Lawson will come back, he won't come back. And so Zach Brown is second in the league in plays, tackles plus assists plus passes defense, behind Luke Kuechly. And he's got 10 defeats, which is near the top of the league, which, of course, is tackles for a loss plus turnovers plus tackles that stop a conversion on third or fourth down. And Alexander has 13 defeats, which is second in the league behind Luke Kuechly, who has 14. This is what life is like without J.J. Watt around.
Yeah.
So you would think that the defense can get better, except that, regression towards previous performance would suggest that neither Brown nor Alexander is going to play at this level for the rest of the year, especially since it's not like they're young players breaking out, right? Alexander is 33 years old. Brown is 27, so he's at his peak. But usually you break out kind of before your peak, not at your peak.
Right.
Anyway, but their defense could be this good all year, and the offense could certainly be this good all year. They're like 12th right now in everything. They're 12th in offense, 11th in defense, and 12th in special teams. And they could absolutely be this team all year, which gives them an outside shot at breaking into the playoffs. I mean, I think they're actually in the playoffs based on the playoff odds right now, but I feel like the playoff odds simulator doesn't have the Buffalo Bills adjustment that it kind of needs to have.
We'll talk about the playoffs for them in a second, but for their offense specifically, like losing Sammy Watkins, it seems surprising to me that they've been as effective offensively as they have been without him. And that's probably just because in my mind, Watkins is a star player and everybody else in their team is sort of a no-name guy. But is this a case of maybe a team being very effective and run heavier because of the quarterback? Why is it that they're so effective offensively without Watkins?
I think they're run heavier because that's just what they want to do.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what they did last year, even when Watkins was healthy. They were very run heavy. And then when they fired Roman, like Ryan said, he's not run heavy enough. So now
Right.
they're even more run heavy, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think they would be a better team with Watkins. They're 6th running and 17th passing.
Yeah.
They would be better than that if Watkins was healthy. I don't think there's a Ewing theory thing going on here, where they're better because Watkins is not in the lineup.
Okay.
They would be better if Watkins was healthy.
So you teased about where they stand in terms of making the playoffs potentially. If we assume that the Patriots, Steelers, and Broncos win their 3 divisions in the AFC, and let's just ignore the AFC South and say that they'll get their division winner and nobody else, who do you think are the front runners at this point for the 2 wild card spots? I'll say that Buffalo and Oakland are the 2 best other teams by DVOA, but Baltimore, San Diego by DVOA, although their record is bad, Kansas City, Cincinnati. I don't know if you have any thoughts about any of those teams potentially getting in the mix, or maybe you like Buffalo and Oakland.
Yeah, we could totally write off the AFC South. There isn't a team in the AFC South that has more than a 3% chance of a wild card. Before the season, I had Baltimore and Cincinnati as the wild cards. I think Cincinnati is mostly out of it at this point. They're clearly not playing as well as years past, plus they're 2-3. Baltimore is still in it. But yeah, by playoff odds, we have Oakland with 69%, Buffalo 58%, Baltimore 42%, Kansas City 40%. And I'm still a believer in Kansas City. I think that their rating is depressed by one colossal blowout loss to Pittsburgh, that they're a better team than that Justin Houston will be back for the second half of the season, which will make them even better. And I think and that they get to pick on that schedule that includes the AFC South, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the whole AFC West, is going to be good this year, including San Diego, despite their record, is a good team. So I would say, if I were to say right now which teams are going to make the playoffs, I would say Oakland and Kansas City. But Buffalo's got a real shot if they keep playing the way that they have the last 3 weeks. And, hey, it would be nice to see them make it after 9 gazillion years.
I'd actually get a pretty big kick if Buffalo and Baltimore both made the playoffs in the seasons when they fired their offensive coordinators. That probably doesn't happen very often.
No, it does not happen very often.
All right. We've been on the air a while, but I saved a little bit of time for this topic. Aaron, please don't twist the knife too badly. We need to talk about the NFC South because it may already be over. Atlanta's 4-1. They have at least a 25% DVOA advantage over every other team in the division, and for some of them it's more. And the other teams in the division have very poor records. The Saints are 1-3, the Panthers are 1-4, and the Bucs are 2-3. So I'll sort of start with this. Is this division race already decided?
I didn't want to believe it until Carolina lost to Tampa.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty much over. We have Atlanta at 81% to win the division. I mean, things can happen. Look at last year, right? Kansas City was 1-4. And they came back to give Denver a run for their money, certainly for the division title.
Yeah.
So, could Carolina go on an 11-game winning streak? Yes. Are they likely to? No.
Doesn't seem like it.
The defense would have to play so much better, right? Forget about Cam Newton getting healthy. And, I mean, I'm surprised by the problems that offense is having this year. Because it's essentially the same offense as last year, except with Kelvin Benjamin. Yeah. It should not be having these problems. There's blocking issues. Newton is pressing. But Greg Olsen is still playing well, and Benjamin has definitely been a step up from the guys that were there last year.
I feel like both.
I don't think Funchess is a guy. I just don't think Funchess is going to be a starting receiver in the NFL.
And it seems like both their offensive and defensive lines have been a lot worse this year, even though they have mostly the same players, and that's been a pretty major problem for the team.
Well, for one thing, I think everyone now knows attack the edges. The tackles are awful.
Yeah. Well, the Panthers are 20th in offensive DVOA, 14th in defensive DVOA, and 29th in special teams. And, man, they've had some brutal special teams plays. But, so, I mean, it's hard not to just say that the Panthers aren't very good. So I think that 11-game win streak is a bit of a pipe dream at this point.
The defense is where you really see that it's not going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the split of 22nd against the pass and 6th against the run. Right? They don't have the pass rush that allows them to get away with a bunch of rookie corners.
You're right. Completely right. That said, I think Atlanta is starting to look more and more legit. I mean, obviously, they win in Denver. That's a really big win, although Paxton Lynch was playing quarterback, who's probably not as good as Trevor Siemian. But they remain number one in offensive DVOA. What are your thoughts on that game specifically against Denver? The thing that really struck out to me was that Julio Jones had just 2 catches for 29 yards on 6 targets. And I actually saw that was sort of a positive takeaway there for Atlanta because they're continuing to sort of spread the ball around. And what you mentioned with the Belichick philosophy of take away your biggest strength. When Denver took away Atlanta's biggest strength on offense, they continued to score points. So, I mean, this offense is really, really good, right?
Yeah, and I think that I think the same thing will happen this week against Seattle, that they'll take away Jones. But Sanu is playing well. But what it really is the running backs.
Yeah.
And Ryan. Ryan is playing extraordinarily well. Okay? So, will that continue for the whole season? Will he have the best season of his career? I don't think he'll continue to average more than 10 yards an attempt all year, but he's playing very well. But those running backs are really good. Not only running, and the offensive line play has been much better overall this year, but, Matthews has finally kind of matured into an NFL good NFL left tackle, and of course Schrader on the right side is pretty good. And, but those guys are really good as receivers. So if you cover Julio Jones, they'll get you a lot underneath with the passes to Coleman and Freeman.
So maybe the bigger story about Atlanta's win in Denver was that Vic Beasley had 4 sacks. Is it possible that he's maturing into like an impact player, and that maybe their 26th overall defensive DVOA defense can be better than that? Or is that maybe just an instance where, you have a rookie quarterback there in a tough spot and maybe he wasn't decisive enough in getting rid of the football?
I would love to say the former because Beasley had such a great sacks year and I like for Football Outsiders to be right, but I think it's more likely the latter because they had the injury at right tackle and the guys who came in and played at right tackle were awful. And that defense still just doesn't have a lot of players who really shine other than Desmond Trufant. I mean, there's young guys who you're like, well, in a couple of years, this could be, they just drafted Keanu Neal. They just drafted the linebacker whose name, Deion Jones. And, if Beasley is getting better, I mean, these are all improvements, right? So that Trufant's not out there on an island by himself going, well, I'm shutting this guy down. I don't know about the rest of you.
Right.
But I think Atlanta's going to continue to be all year what they've been, except, I think they're going to continue to be a top 3 offense and a below average defense. Not just below average, but bad. Their special teams are probably not going to continue to be as good. They're number 4 on special teams right now. They don't have the guys that make me go, they've got Hester, I guess, who's 90,000 years old at this point, but could still run. But they've been really good, like punting and stuff, and that's not, historically, they're not that great at that. So, but I mean, I think that the offense is going to continue to be good enough that they look like they're clearly going to run away with that division. Atlanta looks to me like, and Atlanta Falcons fans listening to this are going to be like, oh, this is so familiar. I hope this doesn't happen again. But they look like that team that takes the 2nd seed and loses.
Oh, no.
Right? Doesn't it seem like there's always a team that's the surprise team, and then they get the 2nd seed, and then they lose at home?
I mean,
in fact, it's Atlanta a lot of the time.
I was about to say the Falcons have done that multiple times, but...
that's what they feel like to me. Right? They feel like the team that's going to go 13-3 because of schedule or whatever, and then Seattle or Dallas or Philly will go in there and beat them with a much more well-rounded team than what they have.
Or maybe that's the Vikings. So who knows? There are a few different teams at the top.
The Vikings will be the number 1 seed.
Okay, maybe you're right. We'll see. But anyway, I think that pretty much wraps up everything we wanted to cover today. Aaron, thanks for joining me. Thanks, everybody, again, who's been listening. Everyone that is listening, remember to check out footballoutsiders.com for their great content, including the premium charting subscription and the daily fantasy projections that we're working together on. It's all great stuff. So, Aaron, I hope you enjoy your Week 6 games, and everyone else, subscribe, and we'll hope to talk to you again next week.